10 years ago, you would have dreamed of owning a PC like this. An overclocked 8-core 16-thread CPU, 32GB of quad-channel memory, and not one, but two of the most powerful graphics cards in the world. A beast like this would have set you back thousands, made you the envy of your friends, and would have been the definition of future-proofing in the year 2014. Now, with the benefit of a decade of hindsight, we can see exactly how future-proof it really was. "2014 was the second year of Haswell. On the desktop front, the refreshed Devil's Canyon range of CPUs took the well-established 22nm process out for yet another spin, with improved thermal interface material to fix the heat problems of its predecessors. In the HEDT world, Haswell E was launched to replace Ivy Bridge E, offering a brand new socket and introducing DDR4 RAM for the first time. Desktop Haswell was still entrenched in the quad-core no more philosophy, while AMD were still trying to offer more cores but lacked an answer to hyperthreading. If I was going to build a 2014 dream PC, I needed more than either of the consumer-focused platforms could provide. It could only be built on X99. Channel regulars may recognise my Gigabyte X99 G1 gaming motherboard from some of my CPU reviews. Released at the end of 2014, its key feature is, of course, that big old 2011 V3 socket, compatible with the full range of Haswell E and Broadwell E series CPUs, though there's a few other features of note. It has an M.2 slot for NVMe SSDs, an overkill number of memory slots, and thanks to quad-channel support, it can benefit from a higher effective data rate than conventional dual-channel platforms. Given that this is first-generation DDR4, memory speeds higher than about 3200 aren't really a thing yet, so quad-channel memory will go away towards closing the gap between this and a more modern system. Another benefit is the presence of multiple full-length Gen 3 PCIe slots. Most CPUs for this socket have 40 lanes of PCIe bandwidth, enough to feed two full-bore X16 graphics cards with bandwidth to spare. The CPU providing those lanes is, of course, an absolute beast too, with 8 cores and 16 threads, a hefty 20MB of level 3 cache, and an unlocked multiplier. The Xeon E5-1660V3 is one of the best performing CPUs of 2014. I say one of because it's essentially the same chip as the more expensive 1680 V3 but with a lower maximum turbo speed, and they're both the Xeon equivalents of the consumer-facing i7 Extreme 5960X. At launch, this was a $1,000 CPU. Now it's worth about $30, but I digress. Fully unlocked and overclocked, one of these now decade-old chips can still compete with a modern quad-core i3 in gaming, and actually gets close to a 6-core i5 in productivity. This is the best single GPU graphics card available that year, the Maxwell-based NVIDIA Geforce GTX 980, specifically the Asus Strix version. And yes, I bought two of them. Don't worry, they're out of warranty anyway. With 4GB of VRAM and 2048 CUDA cores, the 980 wouldn't remain the top GPU for long, with the 980 Ti taking the crown soon after, and the Radeon Fury series putting up spirited competition, but they both launched in 2015. The most compelling alternatives actually available at the time were the R9 290X and Nvidia's own Titan Black. The former I already talked about in the 2013 Dream PC video, and the latter being based on the already dated Kepler architecture and costing twice as much. The rest of the 2014 Dream PC is kind of a mishmash of bits I had around, so not everything is authentically 2014. The case is the Cooler Master HAF 912, that was one of the highlights of the original 2012 incarnation of the Sex Machine, but it's originally from around 2011. The CPU cooler is a brand new Thermalright Phantom Spirit, because my more period-accurate Hyper 212 got overwhelmed by the Xeon even at stock speeds, and my 240mm AIO doesn't fit this case. The RAM is two pairs of 8GB DDR4 4000 sticks I picked up between 2021 and 2022, but which I've downclocked to 2666 for historical accuracy. Again, I originally had some more period-appropriate stuff, but at least one of those sticks turned out to be faulty. Supplying power is my usual EVGA 750W semi-modular PSU, which I've had since around 2017, so it's probably not completely period appropriate either. While it does have enough PCIe connectors to feed both GTX 980s and enough wattage to meet my needs at stock settings, my overclocking options will be quite limited. The CPU has a 140W TDP and runs at 3.3 GHz all-core out of the box, and I've successfully overclocked it to 4.3 in the past, but that pretty much doubled power consumption. To keep things within a more realistic envelope, I settled on a 4 GHz all-core frequency that saw consumption climb to about 240 watts in a CPU-Z stress test. Each GTX 980 can draw about 180 watts under load, which means for a total system power draw of about 480 to 550 watts while gaming. Finally, storage is a crucial P5 Plus 4TB NVMe SSD, which of course would have been beyond the wildest dreams of avarice in 2014, but it made my life easier when moving all these games around. For games, I've chosen titles from around the time this PC would have been brand new, right up until the 2020s, and I've focused where possible on games that support SLI. That did mean I had to scrub a few titles, because despite hours of messing around in NVIDIA Profile Inspector, I just couldn't get them to use both GPUs. In 2013, BioShock Infinite was one of the prettiest games on the platform, and while some of the textures and objects are a bit simple by modern standards, it's still pretty today. It also runs blisteringly fast on this setup. At 1080p Ultra, it's coming close to 300 FPS territory, which was beyond the capability of monitors in that era. Even at 1440p, frames are above 200 FPS, and the only 144Hz at that resolution in 2014 were $700 TN panels. At 4K, the average is still an incredible 118 FPS, and 1% lows are 88, though we do start to see a bit of stutter. Sleeping Dogs often makes it into discussions of underappreciated gems of the gaming world, being something clearly inspired by GTA, but actually doing something different, both in terms of gameplay and storytelling. Its top quality preset is called Extreme, and it's a fitting name. At 1080p, the benchmark only manages just over 100 FPS with minimums of 76. Trying to run Extreme at 1440p is actually tough, with averages still looking pretty playable, but some areas of the benchmark, particularly the latter indoor section, dropping well below 60. Reducing to the high quality preset fixes this, and averages shoot up to 128. At 4K, things are feeling pretty similar to 1440p at Extreme. Averages are very playable, but minimums show just how far below 60 this can go. Trying 4K at Extreme is a fool's errand, as averages fall off a cliff into the mid-teens. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor is a couple of things that are rare to find in the modern day. A movie tie-in, an Arkham clone, and a pretty good game, despite those other two things. This time, owners of even a high-end rig like this one needn't have feared pushing settings all the way to maximum. At 1080, the average passes 180 and approaches 190 FPS, though minimums are very low, a flaw that comes up time and again when testing multi-GPU setups. At 1440p, it's still a remarkably good 140 FPS, and for whatever reasons, the minimums actually hold up a bit better this time. At 4K, the benchmark does falter a little, despite its acceptable 75 FPS average, with minimums only reaching the mid-40s. I don't tend to wheel this one out very often. Grid Autosport is one of the many racing games that's fallen foul of the modern plague of licensing issues, which means you can't actually buy this game through stores anymore. If you're inspired at the sight of a PC simcade racer that isn't Forza, I'm afraid you'll have to try and hunt down an overpriced key online somewhere. Once again, this is a first-class experience, with even 4 times MSAA being achievable on these two Maxwell GPUs. At 1080p, the benchmark averages 160 FPS, and at 1440 that only falls to 145, suggesting either a CPU bottleneck or maybe an SLI scaling limitation. 4K is also incredibly smooth, averaging 92 FPS and not dipping below 73. Not many people realise, but the 90s classic Grand Theft Auto actually had a number of sequels, even getting as far as a 5th numbered entry. I heard rumours about a possible 6th game in development, but I think it's going to be a console-timed exclusive, so it might as well not exist. GTA 5 is still a good time, however, and this PC can tear through it pretty well. Kinda. At 1080 high, I honestly thought it was hitting the 188 FPS cap that causes the Rage engine to start breaking down, but that actually wasn't the case. It was just stuttering horribly, presumably due to SLI. Disabling the second 980 didn't change the average very much, possibly due to a CPU bottleneck, but 1% and 0.1% lows are significantly better, meaning for a far superior experience over SLI. At 1440p, the 2-card setup enjoys over 25% more frames on average than a single card, once more probably being held back by the CPU, but the improved frame pacing and lack of stutter means that the single card is still far more enjoyable. At 4K, it's a bit of a mixed bag. The SLI setup scales perfectly, producing almost double the frame rate of a single card, but minimums are still terrible. The single card, meanwhile, has smoother frame pacing, but fails to hit a 60 FPS average. Pick your poison, I guess. The other game everyone remembers from 2015, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, has had a radical overhaul in recent years to bring it up to 9th gen console standards. However, this is the original version. The new one doesn't support SLI, otherwise I'd probably have tested both. At 1080 Ultra, the performance is pretty strong. The two GTX 980s can produce over 100 FPS, with 1% lows over 60. Turning up to 1440 doesn't require any more compromises to stay playable either, with the average dropping to about 82. At 4K, you'd probably want to drop from the Ultra preset. Not that 46 FPS is completely unplayable, and if you're inclined to play with a controller rather than a mouse and keyboard, you might not even notice. But you could get back up to 60 with a few quality compromises. In 2016, id's long-awaited Doom reboot? Sequel? Rebootful? Anyway, Doom 2016 is a blast to play at high frame rates, and it can reach them on relatively modest hardware. However, it doesn't seem to like multi-GPU setups all that much. In this case, 1080p Ultra hits almost 120 FPS with both cards enabled in OpenGL. SLI doesn't seem to work in Vulkan, however, it doesn't seem to matter all that much, as the single GTX 980 delivers dramatically better results anyway, with 1% lows equal to the average of the SLI setup. You may be starting to see why SLI fell out of favour. Anyway, as if any more proof were needed, at 1440 the single card once again shows its superiority, with a small drop in averages but a huge jump in 1% lows. At 4K, the Ultra preset is the problem, as neither setup reaches 60 FPS, but the SLI cards once more fail to really beat a single GTX 980. " 2017 proved to be a difficult year to test for this video. I initially wanted to try Assassin's Creed Origins to compare it to the Titan series cards I've tested recently, but it doesn't support SLI. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice also seemed a quite relevant game to cover, but after faffing with SLI profiles for a while, the best I could get was either a dangerously flickering image or a stable but slow one, which failed to render half the scene and which crashed after about a minute or two anyway. I settled on Fallout 4, just like the million other YouTubers jumping on the Amazon series hype train, but I guess I can live with that. It's not like I have principles anyway. Like most Bethesda games pre-Starfield, Fallout 4 has a 60 FPS cap, and I learned my lesson with Skyrim. While it's possible to disable this cap, you probably shouldn't. At 1080p, the capped frame rate means that the two GTX 980s are on an extended lunch break, barely breaking a sweat even at max quality. At 1440p, things heat up a little, but I still feel like a single card could be doing just as well. At 4K, the game actually does drop from 60, even into the 30s and 40s when things get hectic, so perhaps the Ultra preset is a bit too much for it to handle. This was a pleasant surprise. Shadow of the Tomb Raider's still a pretty new game in my mind, being the most recent and most microtransaction-infested game of the series, and one of the early standard bearers for ray tracing. However, despite this, it can also support hassle-free SLI, working straight out of the box and delivering over 100 FPS at 1080p. 1440 can still handle the highest settings too, sticking around the 60 mark most of the time. At 4K, I had to drop to high to keep within VRAM limits, and this only allowed for a 30 to 40 FPS experience. Results were quite similar in 2019's Jedi Fallen Order, one of the last games I own that actually supports SLI without complaint. At 1080p with the Epic preset, it's possible to reach over 100 FPS, with lows of 50 that are, unfortunately, all part of the respawned Star Wars experience. See Jedi Survivor for more examples. Out of curiosity, I wanted to see how much this last bastion of SLI support benefited from the second card, and it looks like it adds about 50% performance on average, with the single card only hitting 68 FPS. At 1440p, the SLI rig averaged 74 FPS and was actually still pretty playable. Not bad considering the GTX 980 was 5 years old at this point. 4K was a bit of a struggle. Even dropping to high couldn't improve frame times, and the average of 43 is only okay. While Red Dead Redemption 2 does appear to utilise both GPUs, unfortunately it doesn't really handle SLI at all. Firstly, my Afterburner overlay was constantly flickering, which isn't an issue most gamers will have to put up with, but it's still bloody annoying to me. At 1080p using the hardware unboxed settings, the 980s only score 42 FPS in the canned benchmark, which is actually about 10% slower than a single card, and it's far from smooth, with 1% lows less than half of the average. Naturally, going above 1080p isn't on the cards. Even with textures dropped to high to stay within the VRAM limit, 1440p averages just 32 FPS and lows are in the teens. And again, a single card actually does it a tiny bit better. Alas, the 2020s represents a turning point in this video. From now on, SLI will be a thing of the past, at least in the mainstream, so the last two games are just using one single GTX 980. Horizon Zero Dawn wasn't the best console port, so actually playing it in 2020 would probably have been quite different, but with the benefit of post-launch patches, it's actually quite a smooth experience these days. It is a sign of things to come for the 980, however. 2 years earlier, this was a 1440p ultra-capable GPU. But into the 2020s, it doesn't have enough VRAM for the favour quality preset at 1080p. At Original, this game's version of Medium, it squeezes under the 4GB mark and manages over 70 FPS on average, with percentile lows of 57. It's possible to nudge a couple of settings up to high and still remain mostly above 60, but higher resolutions are pretty much off the table without using FSR. To round out the video, I wanted to pick something recent that I thought the 980 would be capable of running smoothly, which has become something of a rarity in the 2020s. However, I probably underestimated Spider-Man Remastered. It's also pretty hungry on VRAM, so at the very high preset, the averages are around the 50 mark, but 1% lows drop below 30. Dropping to medium helps the averages massively, producing an average of 60 nerf, but 1% lows are still only 36. In reality, if you had the money to build a system like this in 2014, there's very little chance you'd still be running it unchanged in 2024. Certainly around 2017, the writing was on the wall for SLI, and with options like the legendary GTX 1080 Ti offering single card performance and VRAM that are still respectable in the modern day, you'd have been hard-pressed not to upgrade a couple of years down the line. That being said, if you're that rare person who buys an expensive piece of tech expecting it to last this long, it's not all doom and gloom. At least games do still run on this aging monster, even if you do have to turn off the second GPU from time to time. If you're interested in how the GTX 980 fares in other 2023 and 2024 games, this time not in SLI and paired with a more modern, moderately priced gaming PC, I've already made a video about it and it will be linked in the description. If you want to see how the Xeon holds up in CPU limited situations, that video is linked on screen. Now, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.